Hello, my name is Dr. Rima Vesely. I am a visiting professor of Buddhism and Black Studies at Union Theological Seminary, and my privilege to speak with you today about how the religious tradition of Buddhism and the field of moral injury speak to one another, and how Buddhism as a tradition in terms of its doctrines and central teachings, and also how Buddhism as a set of practices might facilitate tending to someone who is suffering from moral injury. So first in this lecture, I'd like to talk with you about a few central teachings within Buddhism that are helpful, I think, in addressing moral injury. And then at the end, to talk about practices and to lead you in a loving kindness meditation that I think, and many others as well, think is a very skillful way to turn towards the suffering that arises from moral injury. So first, to talk about Buddhism as a tradition. Maybe the central teaching within Buddhism is the teaching on suffering, which is known as dukkha in the language of Pali. And dukkha is considered to be the painful. It encompasses different forms of pain, sometimes really subtle, so that we might not even be attuned to it, sometimes acute, sharp and unavoidable. Sometimes this pain is physical, and sometimes this pain is mental. The understanding of dukkha is so central in the Buddhist tradition that the early Buddhist tradition talked about dukkha in four different manifestations. So one is the manifestation of physical conditions. What the Buddha observed is that all physical conditions are subject to decay. Before he was enlightened, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, ventured from his palace, and he saw people in daily life who were suffering from old age and from sickness and from death. And he noticed that all phenomena, all physicality is subject to decay. And he said, this is a form of suffering. And yet another form of suffering are the experiences that arise from mental and emotional afflictions. So suffering is physical on the one hand, as the Buddha noticed, but there's also a dimension of suffering that is mental and emotional. And this is worth distinguishing and taking note of. The Buddha and the Buddhist disciples also said that suffering arises from unpleasantness. So this could be, for example, eating something that tastes bad or might even be spoiled. This could be some kind of sensation that's not attractive or appealing, that might even be grating. So suffering does arise from these, you could say, aspects of the senses. And then lastly, suffering arises from not getting what one wants. And this is essentially a kind of hungering or thirsting that is not satiated. This is a kind of grasping that doesn't get fulfilled. So these are the four different kinds of suffering in human existence. And it's so pervasive, it's so multidimensional that we experience levels of suffering all the time. As we seek, as we thirst and hunger, the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha and his disciples, said that human beings seek three forms of thirst. We seek sensual pleasure, and this can refer to, of course, sensuality and sexuality, but it can also refer to seeking that which makes our senses feel pleasure. So a very soft garment or a very tasty treat. But we seek that, right? We seek a kind of satiation of our senses. We also seek to protect our identities or our egos. We seek to protect our status, to protect our place in the world, if you will. And that too is a form of thirst. And then the Buddha said, we are averse to unpleasantness, which is another way of saying that we seek pleasure, we seek pleasantness. And in that kind of thirsting, we push away anything that is unpleasant. We avoid, we deny, we disrupt, we project, we seek to repress that which is unpleasant, and we seek to grasp that which is pleasant. And essentially, these four aspects of dukkha and then these three aspects of thirsting continue or perpetuate suffering. So what the Buddha wanted in his own life and also for the lives of his disciples is to find a way to transcend this level of suffering or these many levels of suffering. And so what Buddhist scholars will say is that Buddhism teaches that transcending the stress of life, transcending these different levels of suffering, requires fully and realistically assessing the pervasiveness of suffering. So this is another way of saying that in order to transcend suffering, we have to acknowledge it. We have to acknowledge how complex it is. And also what Buddhist scholars have said is that if we ignore these painful aspects of existence, it will lead to attachment. So it will lead to further suffering. To repress, to ignore, to deny, to avoid, all of that leads to perpetuating suffering. But Buddhist monastics and scholars said, if we can acknowledge suffering, we can turn towards it, if we can acknowledge the dimensions of it, the depth of it, that actually it can liberate us. It can purify our intentions, and we can actually experience some liberation. These monastics and contemporary scholars have also said that within the early Buddhist suttas, the early Buddhist teachings, that there's really a twofold aspect to suffering, to the nature of pain. So on the one hand, we experience conditions that are by nature painful. Some of us experience poverty. Some of us experience violence in different ways. Some of us experience war, violence in the home. These conditions, the Buddhists have said, lead to physical and mental pain. They come at us, they land on us, and very often we cannot avoid them. But they have also said, these monastics, these scholars have also said that we can increase our level of suffering or not. It depends on how we react and respond to a situation. If we grasp or we avoid, we can create more pain. If we move from a mind state of reactivity, we can actually create more suffering for ourselves. And so on the one hand, there's much that we can't avoid. There's much that comes at us and that lands on us. And on the other hand, there are skillful ways to respond to that which comes at us. And Buddhism, as a tradition, as doctrines and practices, teaches us how to skillfully respond to everything that is coming at us. You know, one aspect that's so important to keep in mind is that the ways our minds work, the various ways in which our minds react and respond to suffering, is sometimes habitually ingrained and sometimes ingrained due to intergenerational trauma. And I don't want to minimize the aspect of that, because there has been so much important research done on how our brains work and how our nervous systems respond to suffering. And there is a lot that we know. We know that, for example, 3 generations past, if our ancestors experienced tremendous trauma, that they would respond in ways that allowed them to cope and adapt. But sometimes were responses that were particular to that situation of great violence, for example, a state of war, a state of enslavement. And because their nervous systems responded in certain ways to their trauma, that was actually passed down biologically to 3 generations forward, to descendants, 3 generations forward. We have just tremendous scientific research that tells us how intergenerational trauma can pass down to descendants. And it's important to say that, yes, we come into the world and we often are patterned in ways that we may not recognize. We, in our biology, in the ways in which our cells are arranged and our nervous systems are impacted, you know, we may respond to situations in very unconscious ways because we have been impacted by our ancestors and their trauma. This is also something to take into account in terms of how we, in our own lives, meet situations of great harm. And we often can develop patterns, what we might call habitual patterns, behaviors that respond to certain traumas in our own lives. But in these cases, do not serve our happiness, do not serve our peace of mind. And so there's a teaching in Buddhism that I find so useful in understanding all of this. It's a teaching that is part of a larger teaching on how human beings are constructed. So human beings are considered to be impermanent. We do not possess a soul, if you will, something that is central to our way of being, but rather we are in constant transition. We are constantly changing. This teaching is sometimes known as the 5 aggregates, and it refers to constant change in our human beings that pertains to bodies. So we possess bodies that are constantly changing. It pertains to sensations and how we experience our senses, encountering things that are pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. It pertains to perceptions, like how we categorize the world, but that too can constantly change. It pertains to consciousness, and not least, it pertains to an aspect of our makeup that's called mental formations. That's the translation. The Pali term is sankhara. And these mental formations are very, very complex. And actually, the word sankhara has at its root karma. And it suggests actually that we come into the world with certain mental formations. And this, in some ways, in my mind, bears upon the scientific research on how intergenerational trauma is passed down biologically. But this teaching of sankhara in a more contemporary, day-to-day way, in terms of how we experience the world, suggests that we have these complex mental formations and we have these habitual patterns, but if we can recognize our patterns and how they may inflict upon us further suffering, we can actually change our patterns. I find this to be a tremendously liberating teaching, that even if we have ways of reacting that do not serve us, if we can become conscious of those ways of reacting, we can cultivate the capacity to pause. We can cultivate the capacity to offer ourselves compassion. For example, when we have been harmed, when we've been harmed in great ways, or when we've been disrespected in certain settings, in all of these different ways, if we have experienced harm, or if we see ourselves as inflicting harm on other people, we can cultivate ways to pause and see our patterns. And in seeing our patterns, we then have the capacity to change them. It is slow work. Nothing happens overnight. I don't suggest that any of this is easy, but in committing to pausing and to seeing our habitual patterns, seeing our mental formations, we can liberate ourselves from harm that is habitual, that may be unconscious, and we can offer change in ways that may be extremely freeing. And I will just say, in my own life, I have experienced that capacity to say, I see how I want to respond. I see my reactivity, and I'm just going to sit with my discomfort, with my anger, with my fear, with my anguish. I'm going to sit with it and just see it and know it intimately and not react. And I will say in the most personal way that this serves me first and foremost in my interpersonal relationships, in my family life, in my work life, just having the capacity to pause and see my reactivity. And then, and this is what I most want to now move towards, and then to develop some compassion, and then to say, okay, yes, this has happened. This is hard. It's really it's just really frustrating. It's really painful, to be able to acknowledge that, but also to say, and I feel sad about that. And I want to have some compassion for myself and for the other people who are part of this situation. If we can move to a compassionate place when we see these patterns of harm, we actually have some resources then for addressing that harm in skillful ways. It's a kind of training of the mind and heart, if you will. It's a kind of training of how we might, in our various aspects and capacities for reactivity, how we might step back and give some spaciousness to a very painful situation, to a situation of great suffering. So this is to say that there are ways, once we see our habitual patterns, once we see how our minds react to certain situations, we can make some shifts, but we have to have resources to make those shifts. We can't just decide to make them and then they happen. We actually have to practice, and we have to have, you could say, the raincoat when it's raining, just to make sure that we have something to default to that will serve us, so that when it's raining, when it's pouring, we can turn to a place of inner protection. In Buddhism, the language is refuge, that we can turn to a place of inner refuge and wish compassion for ourselves. So, the practice I want to conclude with today is known as metta. It translates into loving kindness. The Pali term is metta, but it means loving kindness. And we have approximately 9 minutes left. And in that 9 minutes, I want to lead you into a meditation in which we practice. And if you then in your own life can use this practice to serve your own inner well-being, it will then be a way for you to work with the participants in your various settings and to offer them some resources for their own emotional landscape, their mental and emotional states of mind. And when they are suffering from moral injury, to perhaps start to have a place of refuge that they can access, a kind of landing place emotionally. I think this is a very, very powerful practice. And it leads to a kind of inner liberation that allows for the work to be done, the hard emotional work of healing to take place. So now I invite you to find a place that allows you to feel ease. Perhaps this is sitting in a chair, or perhaps lying on a bed or lying on the floor. Perhaps this is standing. Sometimes people will walk, but a way of holding your body in which your body has some ease. So as you settle or find a way to attune to your body, invite you to think about a time in your life, perhaps it's the present, or perhaps when you were a child, a time in your life when you could see your goodness, see yourself as someone worthy of receiving love and affection. When you could receive that love and nothing interrupted that receptivity. As you take a deep breath, try to fill your cells with oxygen. I invite you to bring that version, that part of yourself, to the forefront of your mind. And as you bring that part of yourself to the forefront of your mind, just to maybe smile and remember, really attune to the beauty of that human, that version of yourself. And then to say, may I be safe and protected. May I be safe and protected. May I be peaceful and happy. May I be peaceful and happy. May I be healthy and strong. May I be healthy and strong. May I live with ease and well-being. May I be safe and protected. May I be peaceful and happy. May I be healthy and strong. May I live with ease and well-being. And as you repeat these phrases to yourself, perhaps with one of your program participants, perhaps with a group of program participants, so important to keep in mind that in wishing compassion for ourselves, we are resourcing ourselves, and that compassion will very naturally extend outward, that people will feel it as a kind of radiance. It's important to start with ourselves. It's important to have the resources to turn towards suffering. And compassion does allow us to recognize the different dimensions of suffering and then to take refuge and to cultivate that within our lives. Be well. I send you peace. Be well.